introduce myself. I'm Monica Cash and I'm the Deputy Librarian at the Linen Hall. And I'd like to welcome you all here today for today's lunchtime talk. And I'm delighted to introduce historian and academic Pamela Linden Aveyard, who is going to speak to us today on the subject of Gathered Lightpoints, a reconstruction of the lives, work and journeys of Alice Berger Hammerschlag and Helen Lewis. So those two names, Alice Berger Hammerschlag and Helen Lewis, are probably known to most of you in the audience. Alice was a visual artist and Helen was a dancer and choreographer. Both these women played a significant part in the creative life of Belfast. They were not born here, but made new lives for themselves in this city. Both were refugees. Alice, who had escaped from Nazi regime to settle in Belfast in 1938, and Helen, a Holocaust survivor, who came to Belfast 10 years later in 1948. The Linen Hall is privileged to hold material relating to both these extraordinary women. We hold a collection of letters that Alice wrote to her friend and fellow artist, Mercy McCann, and we have a Helen Lewis archive, which includes photographs, manuscripts and programmes. Pamela is going to talk to us about these two remarkable artists, their enduring friendship, and the huge contribution that they made to the artistic life of Belfast. So I'd just like to tell you a little bit about our speaker today. Pamela is a historian of migration and Irish-British Jewry and a visiting research fellow at Queen's University Belfast's Centre for Public History. She completed her PhD thesis entitled Jewish Identity and Community in Belfast, 1920 to 48, at Queen's University in 2016. She has worked across the museum and heritage sector, most recently holding the posts of Second World War and Holocaust Partnership Programme Officer at the Imperial War Museum. She has a particular interest in forced migration and intersecting identities, and she is currently undertaking research on refugee networks and Belfast Jewish naturalisation. After the talk, there will be an opportunity for questions, so now it is my pleasure to pass you over to Pamela. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you all for coming along this afternoon. I know we have some of Helen's dancers in the group today, so thank you particularly for coming along. Today's talk will look at the lives, the work and the friendship of two Jewish female artists who came to Northern Ireland as a result of Nazi atrocities in Europe, Alice Berger Hammerschlag and Helen Lewis. Alice and Helen first met in Belfast in 1948, and they shared a lot in common. They were both Jewish women who were born in Central Europe during the First World War, and they both trained in their respective arts in Central European capital cities. They both suffered forced migration when the Nazi Party came to power, and they both moved to Northern Ireland and became well known as professional artists, and they lived here in Belfast until their death. But for a portion of their lives, from 1938 and in the decade that followed, their trajectories were very different. Alice left Vienna with her family in 1938 and moved to the UK as a refugee. Helen was deported to the Theresian Ghetto in 1942, and she survived the Auschwitz, Stutthof and Coxted camps. She arrived in Belfast in 1947, not as a refugee, but as a British citizen, having married Harry Lewis in Prague that same year. During this talk, I want to look at two main areas. Firstly, I want to reconstruct the events that preceded the arrival of both Alice and Helen in Belfast. And secondly, rather than define these women by their wartime experiences, I want to reconstruct their lives after the Second World War, and in particular their art, their recognition as professional artists, and the importance of their friendship. I'm aware that many of you here may be more familiar with Helen's life and her career in Belfast, so this talk will be slightly weighted more towards Alice's experiences. But to me, the really interesting parts are the moments when these two women's lives overlap and intersect and they influence each other's art. It's extremely rare to uncover in historical records a detailed insight into female friendship, particularly in 1960s Belfast, and especially when it relates to art and the creative processes. I chose this painting to illustrate the talk. It's Alice's Gathered Lightpoints, painted in, that should actually say 1961, sorry, it's 1968. And I think I chose it because I think it reflects the lives of these two women, and it reflects their friendship and their work. I feel it's a painting that's full of movement and complexity. I feel like it's vibrating with possibilities. I really like it. And it reminds me of writing the historical record. I think historians are sometimes a little bit underhand about how we write history. We create a very polished story as if the facts are very complete and they fit together perfectly. Actually, the historic record is very simple or static, and we update it and we revise it in light of new evidence. And this talk is not intended to be a definitive account, but rather, like this picture, I want to show you some moments in time. And I want to consider Alice and Helen's histories in the context of national, local, and global events. And to do that, we're going to begin our story in First World War Vienna. Alice Berger was born on the 18th of February 1917 to Hugo Berger, a chartered accountant, and his wife Olga Vushak, who originated from Hungary. Her parents registered the child's birth at the Israelitische Kultusgemeinde Vienna, so that's the Jewish religious community in Vienna. We don't think her parents were particularly religiously observant, but they were part of that Viennese Jewish community, and they registered the births of their children there. Alice had an older sister named Gertrude, who was known as Trudy, and she was 7 years older than Alice. She was born during peacetime. And the family lived at Clusiusgasse in the Alstergrund district of North Vienna. And as a child, we are told that Alice was never seen without paper and pencil in her hands. We have here a diploma, I think dated 1928. And it was given to Alice because she won when she was 11 years old an art competition organised by the International Save the Children Union. And I think the award must have meant a great deal to either Alice or her parents, as they brought it with them when they left Vienna. From age 12, Alice studied at the Vienna Kunstgewerbeschule, that's the School of Arts and Crafts in Vienna, where she was taught by Franz Chiswick, who was well known as a pioneer of art education for children. This was a decade of danger and anxiety for Austrian Jews. Throughout the 1930s, when Alice was attending art school as a teenager, Jews in Vienna were regularly the target of violent attacks and harassment. In March 1938, Germany annexed Austria and anti-Jewish legislation was quickly introduced. In July 1938, Alice was issued with a new passport, and it's stamped with Nazi insignia, and it identifies her as Jewish. The Berger family, like thousands of other Jews in Central Europe, made urgent arrangements to leave and seek refuge in the UK, and they managed to successfully secure guarantors for the family. At that time, no refugee was permitted to enter the United Kingdom without a guarantor, and they had to prove that they could financially support those refugees before they were allowed in. On the 4th of August 1938, Alice was granted a visa to enter the United Kingdom, and the following day she boarded a flight to Croydon, and she escaped with her family to live in the UK as friendly aliens. Hugo and Olga Berger found lodgings together in West Holland Park near Kensington in London, and Alice's older sister Trudy lived only a few streets away from her parents on Addison Road in London, working as a housekeeper. Trudy was one of around 20,000 Jewish refugees who worked as domestic servants at homes across the UK during the Second World War. The reason why so many worked in that role is that refugees were usually forbidden from undertaking paid employment as a measure to protect the British job market. For Alice, however, her work and her willingness to travel to Northern Ireland provided her with a rare opportunity to work in paid skilled employment. Within a few days of Alice's arrival in England, she made the journey to Northern Ireland, and she arrived here as one of 6 Viennese refugees who took on specialised skilled positions at a manufacturing business in North Down. Those businesses were especially facilitated under a piece of legislation known as the New Industries Development Act, which was passed in 1957. And the Department of Commerce at Stormont would give money to establish businesses that would inject the local economy with the potential to have sustainable employment. Not very much changes, perhaps. She received permission to work specifically from the Department of Commerce, who identified her skills as beneficial to stimulating growth in the local economy. And she took on the role of designer, and she was to instruct around 60 local women in the production of gloves, belts, handbags, and other accessories, all made using Irish linen. Lodgings for Alice and the other 4 women in the group were found in Bangor at Dufferin Avenue. The building's been modern, like redeveloped. It's quite a modern building now, but it's still standing. Among Alice's personal effects are sketches of 2 of the women that she boarded with, and this is one of the women called Wilma. I love this title, Wilma Joyful. So we don't have Alice's testimony of her experiences of working at this company, but what we do have here is evidence that she was still drawing, she's still creating during this time. And crucially, 6 years later, in October of 1944, Alice is recognised as an artist in her own right when her work was included in the Ulster Academy of Arts Autumn Exhibition, alongside that of Mercy Hunter, Maeve Gordon and Gladys McCain. When the newspaper reported her inclusion in the exhibition, it noted how the work demonstrated interesting treatments of old themes. Alice Berger was publicly recognised at this point not as a refugee, but as an artist. To move on to Helen's beginnings and her arrival from Truthnov to Belfast. In 1922, Helen Lewis published her memoir, A Time to Speak. From then until her death in 2009, Helen spoke publicly at schools and events, as well as on television and radio, about her experiences. As such, some aspects of Helen's story are very well known to many in Northern Ireland. But for any of you who are unfamiliar with Helen's story as it was told in her memoir, I'm going to just really briefly summarise those key times and dates and places. Helen Katz was born on the 22nd of June, 1916 to Hugo and Elsa Katz in Truthnov, a large town in what was then Czechoslovakia, where the Katz family had owned the shop since the late 19th century. In 1935, Helen and her mother, now widowed, moved to Prague, where Helen studied dance and also enrolled at the German University in Prague to study philosophy. During 1937, Helen met Paul Hermann, and the 2 married in June of the following year. After Hitler's declaration of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia in March 1939, a series of anti-Jewish laws were introduced that banned Jews from public and professional positions, outlawed Jewish companies, and confiscated property. In August 1942, Helen and her husband Paul were deported from Prague to the Terezin ghetto. During her 2 years at Terezin, Helen contracted peritonitis and developed abscesses and a fistula that required major surgery. In May 1944, Helen and Paul were transported together to Auschwitz-Birkenau, and they were separated upon arrival. Paul Hermann was transferred to Schwarzenheim concentration camp, and he died on a forced march. In August 1944, Helen was transferred to Stutthof concentration camp, and from there was sent to a labour subcamp at Coxstedt, where she spent the autumn and winter of 1944. Following the evacuation of this subcamp in February 1945, Helen, along with the other prisoners, was forced to march to Lauenburg, a distance of around 240 kilometres, in freezing conditions on a march that killed many of the camp inmates. Helen survived by falling into a ditch of snow and crawling to a nearby house. She spent the spring of 1945 in Lauenburg Lazaret. It was a site converted for a hospital for survivors of the surrounding camps. Helen's journey to Belfast came about as a result of her reacquaintance with Harry Lewis. Both Harry and Helen were born and spent their youth in Truthnov. Now, Truthnov is the key to our story. It's the thread that appears in this network of friendships that connected both Alice and Helen. Trutnov, or Trutnau in German, was one of the key centres of the Czech linen trade. In fact, Trutnov was so deeply reliant on flax as its major industry that it was referred to in the Times as the Austrian Belfast. Austrian here referring to Czechoslovakia's position within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Michael Lewis, Helen's son, tells me that in the museum at Trutnov, there's machinery by Mackey's in Belfast that they used in Trutnov in the textile industry. Harry Louis, or Louvet as they pronounced it originally, was born on the 18th of February 1909 to Mina, sometimes Minnie, Max Louis, the latter a textile merchant who moved to Trutnov a few years before Harry's birth. On a summer evening in 1932, Harry met Helen at a dance at a garden restaurant in a popular spa. On recounting the evening they met, Helen described how the two began a light-hearted romance between a sophisticated, worldly wise young man and a provincial schoolgirl with aspirations in the world of the arts. The relationship ended while Helen pursued her dance career in Prague, although the two remained friends, and Harry visited Helen and her husband Paul in Prague. Helen said goodbye to Harry on the 31st of March 1939, when Harry left Prague to travel to England and eventually to Northern Ireland. It was 6 years before the two would reunite. It was Harry who first met Alice Berger, as Alice was the younger sister of Harry's university girlfriend, Trudy Berger. Harry and Trudy graduated together from university in Vienna and took the same postgraduate course in Florence, where they both received their doctorates. During that time, Harry visited the Berger family home in Vienna, and he later spoke to Helen about seeing Alice there. But Trutnov also connects our story to Heinz Hammerschlag. During the 1930s, Heinz Hammerschlag moved to Trutnov to marry a girl from the town named Hilda, and while living there, he became friends with Harry Lewis. Helen also knew this Trutnov family as a child, as Hilda's younger brother was in the same school class as her. In a chance encounter with Hilda Hammerschlag in Prague, Helen was so pleased to see her in early 1942 that she invited Hilda back to her apartment, where Hilda revealed that her husband Heinz had moved to Northern Ireland shortly before the occupation of Prague. Heinz had planned to relocate Hilda and their families once he was established in work and could find guarantors for them. But Hilda postponed her plans to travel to the UK and remained in Prague with her mother until her arrest in 1942. Hilda and her mother were deported to the east and both were murdered in the Holocaust. Heinz Hammerschlag arrived in Northern Ireland in 1938, and he found work as the technical manager and co-director of a company that manufactured dresses and coats. And this textile industry is really key to what brings Viennese refugees and refugees in Czechoslovakia over to Northern Ireland. He also found lodgings in Bangor on Dufferin Avenue, only a few doors down from the accommodation shared by Alice and her Viennese colleagues. This close proximity of Heinz to Alice and the other Viennese workers is not coincidental, but rather it represents a complex network of business and personal contacts created by refugees and the established Jewish community in Northern Ireland. Heinz Hammerschlag and Alice Berger were married by Rabbi Schachter in a small religious ceremony at the rabbi's home at Clifton Park Avenue. The newspaper notice stated that the two were married very quietly. I think that's a reference to the very tragic circumstances surrounding Hilda's death. Heinz was granted British citizenship in October 1946, and he was also given permission by the Home Office to bring over his two elderly parents who had survived the Theresian ghetto and bring those two people to Northern Ireland. To return to Helen and Harry were reunited in 1945 after Harry spotted Helen's name on a Red Cross list of camp survivors. The two arranged to marry, and Harry set about arranging a visa to enable Helen to travel to Northern Ireland. The paperwork on that was quite complicated. He's in quite a long conversation with the Department of Commerce. But the paperwork was made a great deal simpler when Harry was granted British citizenship in January 1947. And in May of that year, the Stormont Ministry of Commerce issued Harry with the necessary papers to travel to Czechoslovakia on the official pretext that the visit was actually for a business trip for the company that he was working for. 4 weeks later, Harry Lewis married Helen Hermanova, as she was, at Prague's Old Town Hall. The couple honeymooned in their childhood home of Trutnov, and they returned together to Belfast as married British citizens on October 1947. Helen said in her son's account that it was very important to her that she would return, or she would come to Northern Ireland as a British citizen. She came with full rights. She didn't come as a refugee. She wasn't coming for a temporary period. She came here permanently, and she came with full permissions as a British citizen. Helen described her arrival in Belfast as full of joyful anticipation and curiosity, tempered by moments of slight anxiety. And she credited her transfer to such a completely different environment as a great help in overcoming the shadow of her past suffering. One of the first of Harry's friends that Helen met in Belfast was Alice Hammerschlag, in what Helen termed a dramatic meeting, during which they both realised that Helen was the only person known to Heinz who had seen and spoken to Hilda before her transportation to Terezin. 6 weeks before Helen's marriage to Harry, Heinz had himself remarried. And when Helen and Alice were introduced, Helen said they liked each other at once. And she said, quote, "We could not yet know that our meeting was the beginning of a friendship that would give a new dimension to this world." In an article published when Helen was aged 85, she discussed her experience of bereavement and the uniquely cruel grief experienced by those whose family were murdered in the camps. In examining how she rebuilt her life and overcame dark periods, Helen stated, quote, "Beyond my happy marriage and 2 lovely children, what sustained me was my very close, intimate, and precious friendship with Alice. It was the sort you don't find every day, one of those rare and unique communications, a spiritual closeness, enriching life deeply. We were as close as any 2 people can be." In an unpublished memoir written by Helen about her relationship with Litzy, which is what she termed Alice, she expanded on the importance of this spiritual connection between the friends. She said, "Litzy was an artist whose abstract paintings testified not only to her enormous talent, but also to her deep spirituality. Sitting with her in her studio, surrounded by her work in progress, was in itself a spiritual experience that awoke deep longings in my heart. We shared so much, including Trudy and Harry, that we became deeply grateful to the fates that had brought us together." Alice was a keen letter writer, and she and Helen sustained a regular communication by pen during periods when they travelled for work, family commitments, and holidays. In Alice's surviving letters to Helen, we are given a glimpse into the deep connection that grew between these 2 women. Alice addressed Helen, Harry, and their 2 sons by pet names. I won't divulge those, they're much too personal. But the correspondence is full of emotive language, so much humour, dramatic punctuation, private jokes, and shared personal knowledge. The range of subjects on which these 2 women conversed spanned philosophy, religion, and post-war politics, as well as personal concerns about illnesses and the care of children, Helen had 2 sons, and elderly relatives. One of the key things that we can find in these personal papers that we don't see in the state archival record or in newspapers are the challenges that both Alice and Helen faced in balancing work and caring commitments. When considering their domestic arrangements, it is important to remember the dislocation of immediate and extended family networks experienced by refugees and Holocaust survivors. Family and friendship networks were permanently and drastically altered. Alice took on the responsibilities of arranging care both for her own parents in London and her in-laws, Heinz's parents. Alexander and Rosa Hammerschlag survived the Terezin ghetto, but the physical and the mental toll of their incarceration there left them weak, and they returned to their hometown of Brno with no family to care or provide for them. Heinz's younger brother, George, was transported to Auschwitz before being forced to work in a coal mine at Fürstengrube subcamp. Eyewitnesses testified that he was shot by Nazi guards 2 days before the camp was liberated. Heinz's parents suffered both physically and mentally as a result of their experiences. They lost half their body weight during the years that they spent at Theresa. Although Heinz successfully negotiated his parents' transfer to Northern Ireland, and they did in fact come here, they initially found the prospect daunting. When they arrived in London, with its much larger Jewish refugee community and survivor community, the couple made friends, and they wished originally to remain in England rather than move yet again. When writing to Helen from London, Alice explained how moving Heinz's parents to Northern Ireland would, quote, mean a complete transplanting and getting used to a different life, which, even supposing it were better, would mean too much of a change at their time of life. At that same time, Helen was making plans for Harry's mother, Minnie, who was now widowed, to move into their family home. Alice's correspondence with Helen during this time reflects the understanding and solidarity of a woman who had transitioned from the role of daughter to carer. And she reassured Helen that she had the strength to take on this role for her mother-in-law. She wrote to her, "Do not forget that you were doing the right thing, taking Mama and living with her. Whatever might occur, you can and will take it, and not only take it, but take it well." Harry and Helen did not have a wide network of relatives on which to depend. In an interview conducted with Helen's eldest son, Michael, he stated, "I didn't have any aunts or uncles. We didn't have any family. Lizzie, that's Alice, was as close to family as you could get. And Heinz had a role as well." Helen remembered that both her boys adored Alice from babyhood. They acquired in her, she said, the best auntie in the world. While the caring responsibility and unpaid labour that is disproportionately undertaken by middle-aged women right up to today may be universal, the reconfiguration of caring and domestic arrangements for displaced and resettled refugees and survivor families is an important and understudied aspect of life following the Second World War. Helen and Alice's correspondence provides an insight into the circumstances of these individual survivor and refugee families who established new networks of care and support in the places where they resettled. The move made by these parents to Northern Ireland, with its small Jewish community and even smaller community of refugees and survivors, should not be underestimated, nor should the emotional labour undertaken by those who supported parents, spouses, and other relatives who had experienced displacement, mental and physical torture, and the murder of relatives in the Holocaust. While in London during her mother's hospital admission in 1955, Alice assured Helen that she had not stopped painting. Her correspondence reveals that she had cleared all of the things in her London accommodation and moved the table in front of a big window to do, in her words, some work. The act was not merely cathartic, but the continuation of her professional life. She declared to Helen in this letter, "You know, I only consider drawing and painting work as far as I am concerned." Alice was a founding member of the Ulster Society of Women Artists, formed in January 1958, with Alice acting as joint honorary secretary alongside the artist Deborah Brown. But in spite of the USWA's aims to gain recognition for women artists, interviews with Alice by the local press in these years only appeared in the women's pages of Belfast's two largest newspapers. The late Kenneth Jameson, former director of the Arts Council in Northern Ireland, wrote a very substantial review of Alice's first solo exhibition in 1959, and he included quotes from Alice about her method and her purpose in the medium of abstract art. The review was set between a feature on cotton dresses and a large advertisement encouraging mothers to give their children fresh fruit. In a feature on Alice in the Belfast Telegraph, her photograph and the accompanying article appeared between a recipe for Irish stew and handy hints for cleaning rugs. That was not the case for Alice's male contemporaries, such as Colin Middleton or T.P. Flanagan, whose photographs and interviews were featured on the main news pages or in the arts and pastime sections of both the Belfast Newsletter and Belfast Telegraph at this time. But whatever the press's coverage of Alice's work, the art that she created in the 1950s sold well. And by the early 1960s, she made her living solely as a professional artist. transformation from graphic designer to commercially successful artist had taken place gradually over 2 decades. During that time, Alice left the company in North Down, where she was overseeing the manufacturing and design work, and she worked freelance, creating designs for textiles, accessories, and greeting cards. These are little handkerchiefs that she did the design for. I think in the one on the left, you see maybe a little bit of the essence of Alice's work. The other two, I can't find her at all in them. But as a freelance worker and as a big piece worker myself, sometimes you take on work that maybe wouldn't be your first choice, but they're very important to your development as a professional. But this freelance work that she took on came to an end in 1962 with the success of a major exhibition of Alice's work. The exhibition was sponsored by SEMA, and it was held at the Belfast Jewish Gallery, and it featured what are now some of Alice's best known paintings. It featured Element of Force, Calvary, Old and New, and Appeal for Amnesty. This exhibition was a watershed moment for Alice, marking her transition from a designer who painted in her spare time to an artist devoted to and crucially earning a wage from her art. In an interview given to mark the opening of the exhibition, Alice stated, "I have given up commercial work and I'm devoting my time entirely to painting." Alice's work was also critiqued now as a professional, and not all of the critics appreciated her abstract style. The Belfast newsletter, when covering the opening of the '62 exhibition, featured a large photograph of the artist smiling next to one of her paintings. The happy image was in direct contrast to an extremely negative review of the exhibition written by the newspaper's art critic Frederick Allen. In what Allen termed, quote, "a display of semi-controlled accidents," he dismissed the paintings on display as merely doodles, which could mean almost anything or nothing. Allen was particularly vexed at the titles that accompanied Alice's work, and he found that only 2 paintings with more literal descriptions allowed him to, quote, "appreciate a graphic statement of a peace of mind." In direct contrast, however, Kenneth Jameson, writing as art critic for the Belfast Telegraph, gave a much more positive review. Jameson at that point was working as exhibitions officer for the Arts Council, and he described Alice's work as word pictures and austere statements communicating forcefully and decisively themes and emotions of general experience and common concern. Jameson perceived in Alice's painting The Grail Legend a romanticism of near Wagnerian intensity. Incidentally, Frederick Warren had also prepared the same painting, but only for its more literal title. But whatever the critics' opinions, the 1962 exhibition sales were particularly strong. The Belfast newsletter, in the same edition as Allen had published his very dismissive review, recorded that on opening night, Alice's paintings were selling like hotcakes. She sold 24 of the 35 works on show for £350 in the first 3 weeks of the month-long exhibition. The decade of the 1960s was one of frenetic professional activity for Alice, with 10 solo exhibitions and paintings included in over 30 group shows. The gallery at Queen's University Belfast hosted 3 solo Berger Hammerschlag exhibitions, and her work was selected for a solo show at the Ulster office in Regent Street in 1966. The Dawson Gallery in Dublin exhibited her work in '65 and '68, and she contributed to the Irish exhibition of living art each year between 1961 and '67. Alice also exhibited widely in Great Britain and held solo exhibitions in Manchester and Bristol. She was a regular contributor to the exhibitions of the Women's International Art Club and was an invited guest of the Scottish Society of Women Artists. Her inclusion in group shows saw her work exhibited in Paris, Cannes, Rome, New York, and Florida. One art critic commented that collectors of Alice's art reads like a United Nations roll call. Over the course of the decade, Alice's art moved from the recipe and the fashion of the women's pages to the front page of the news. This is an October 1968 page from the Belfast newsletter. It's very much of its time. We have some political historians in here today. They'll be more at ease with this, but we have here another Ulster row at Westminster. I said before, nothing much changes. We have Harold Wilson, who's accusing Terence O'Neill of being blackmailed by thugs. And he's telling Lawrence Orr that he doesn't need to take his word for things now that they have television cameras in Belfast. But they're sharing the front page and the column images and the photographs here with Alice's art. We have transcendent spheres here enlarged. This isn't Alice. This is a young female student that they have used to illustrate the piece with. And this is when it's on display at Queen's University. Alice's career as an artist also extended to gallery director, where she mentored and promoted the work of other artists. In 1963, Alice took on the role of director of the New Gallery, an art gallery established by Mary O'Malley at Grosvenor Road as part of the Lyric Players' suite of cultural endeavours. While the New Gallery was one of Belfast's smallest art galleries, it produced an exhibition around every 4 to 6 weeks. The position of director required Alice to manage the logistical arrangements associated with the transfer, installation, and de-installation of artwork that included sculptures, paintings, lithographs, and books. She accepted the position, which importantly came with no salary, as she believed the role would offer an opportunity to, in her words, try to combine the most interesting aspects in all art forms and so be operative in raising the standard of appreciation. The art exhibited at the New Gallery was intended to showcase internationally known artists or those of notable prominence. And Alice delivered on this brief, curating over 50 shows of Irish and international artists in the 6 years of her directorship. Alice was given the freedom to select the artists invited to exhibit, and her selections demonstrated both her own artistic preferences and a commitment to championing lesser-known artists. She had a clear preference for showcasing abstract art. Around 30 of the exhibitions that ran at the New Gallery featured abstract art in paintings or sculpture. And some of these were well-known established Ulster artists who were Alice's friends and peers, such as Basil Blackshaw, Deborah Brown, Colin Middleton, Anna Ritchie, George McCann. You've mentioned already, we have beautiful letters between Mercy Hunter, George McCann, and Alice held here at the Linen Hall's collections. And those letters show the very informal nature of arrangements between these close friends when they're exhibiting at the New Gallery. But visitors to the gallery also had the chance to view the work of abstract artists who rarely exhibited in Northern Ireland, such as the large, vibrant canvases of Gillian Ayres, the paintings of the artist and ballet set designer Nicholas Georgiadis, the sculptures of Tasmanian-born Olive Richmond, and the avant-garde creations of the Polish-born artist Franziska Temerson. Temerson was herself a Jewish refugee who settled in the UK. The modern art that Alice selected for the New Gallery was not always well received by the critics. One of the early group shows of abstract art that Alice directed was reviewed under the headline, "Pictures Not Readily Comprehended." Frederick Allen described the Georgiadis 1964 exhibitions as studied negligence in deserts of meaningless shapes. And the Belfast Telegraph reviewed a young Neil Shawcross's first solo work at the New Gallery in 1965 as an inconsiderable exhibition of inconsequential work. They said his painting The Boxer was a blow to the intelligence of the beholder. Abstract art was not an easy sell in 1960s Belfast, but Alice persisted. Peter Brook, in his study of Alice's life and art, quoted Neil Shawcross's recollection of the negative press reviews. He said, "Alice's reaction was characteristic. She immediately offered me another exhibition." And her persistence paid off. Shawcross's second New Gallery exhibition saw his work reviewed by the same critic as altogether delightful. To move on to Helen's professional dancing career. As you know, an excellent study of Helen's career has recently been published by Maddie Tongue, herself one of Helen's dancers, and I know that Maddie and Michael Longley spoke here just a few weeks ago about that publication. So rather than cover that ground, I'm only going to very briefly summarise Helen's dancing career in Belfast. Helen is first reported in the Belfast press in March 1955, when she danced a Slavonic national dance at a performance given by the Belfast Ballet Company, where they had the studio at 53 High Street. She continued her association with the ballet club into the early 60s and received good reviews for her choreography of the Golden Spinning Wheel. Between 1956 and 1962, Helen taught what were occasionally called keep fit classes, or as Helen advertised them, movement classes for slimming, poise and deportment. And you can see some wonderful examples of those advertisements in the local Jewish community newspaper, the Belfast Jewish Record, as well as in the general press. By 1962, Helen had about 55 or so private pupils, a mix of mostly adult women, teenagers and children. But her classes changed as she took on more choreography work. Helen's association with the lyric players, which is key in her professional life, commenced in 1956 when she choreographed the dances for the children of Lear. And Helen continued to work with Mary O'Malley and the lyric players right through the 1960s. There's a very good study of that in Bernard Adams' book Fierce Love, which was published in 2022, if you want to find out more about Alice and Helen's relationship with Mary O'Malley. Helen's vision and her style of dance, influenced by Rudolf von Laban, pioneer of choreology and community dance, drove her to establish the Belfast Modern Dance Group, who gave their first performance in 1962. And this commenced a decade of very important professional work for Helen, directing and producing her first major work of modern dance, as well as choreographing dozens of theatrical and dance works. But for the remainder of our time, I want to focus on the work that Helen and Alice collaborated on together. And I want to consider the motivations and the inspirations of that work. The work that was created by Alice and Helen during the early 1960s represents the beginning of their professional careers. And although they worked in very different art forms, each woman had been influential in supporting and informing the other's art since the beginning of their friendship. Alice's art was created as a solitary endeavour, but by contrast, Helen's choreography and her performance art situated her work within a theatre or a dance group. It's a group activity. But neither of these women were constrained by forms of convention. In their own words, they spoke about how their art was informed by other disciplines, Helen by visual art and painting, and Alice by the movement of performance in dance and theatre. And I've got two interesting examples of this, which are important in explaining both why and how Alice and Helen worked together as painter and dancer. The first comes from an article published by the Belfast Jewish Record, in which Helen explained, as she was often asked to do in the press, the style of her modern dancing. She gets asked a lot, is it ballet or what is this style of dance that you're doing? And the article stated, modern dance is really derived from classical ballet, and the new style emerged almost as a reaction against classical ballet. Mrs. Lewis says it is like a new school of painting and tries to break away from the academic approach to ballet. And I find it really interesting that in describing her modern approach to dance, Helen used as a reference point a new school of painting. And we're going to look shortly at how Helen expanded on that use of art and colour while directing and producing. Similarly, Alice saw direct parallels between theatre and abstract art and painting. And in an interview to the BBC, she spoke about what she saw as the shared values of performance and visual art. She said, to me, the Yeats plays are trying to show the striving for higher ethical values, the strength of each character, how he overcomes struggles, how he strives for them, or how he fails. These are all abstract values and expressed in colour and form. The form the set takes comes from the content of the situation. The colour comes from the reaction of each of the characters, how they react to the situation, how they are made, how each character stumbles, gets up again, rises, and maybe at the end fails to the outward eye, but probably not to the inward. He reaches probably the highest point he can reach. And that was in June 1965. So here we have two artists who are best friends, a painter talking about theatre, a choreographer and dancer talking about paintings, and we can begin to see how their professional relationship was symbiotic. From the late 1950s, Helen and Alice worked together at the Lyric Players on the same productions, and both became associated with a minimalist style. Alice's sets are often described in the press as stark. Her design for Riders to the Sea came as a slight shock to audiences who were more familiar with the traditional setting of a stone cottage and a turf fire. But theatre-goers soon came to accept the simple and symbolical scenery as a suitable accompaniment to Helen's minimalist choreography. Alice and Helen collaborated many times on the Lyric Players' production of Yeats. Both individually received very high praise for their work on the special centenary programme of Yeats at the Lyric Theatre. The production was reviewed as impeccable, praising Helen's choreography and a set design by Alice that was stark and evocative of the mystery and abstract legend. The quality of the Yeats performances on which Alice and Helen collaborated was no doubt high, but Irish theatre was a relatively easy sell in 1960s Belfast. For both women, however, their artistic inclination led them towards the creation of new art, modern art in an abstract form, and their future collaborations pushed the boundaries of performance art in Northern Ireland. And how better to push the boundaries than to do so with a friend? Alice once wrote to Helen about sharing their joys and troubles, and she said, "I had rather you could just share the joys, but mit gehangen mit gefangen," which roughly translates as, "You hang around together, you get caught together," or in a catchier rendering, "cling together, swing together." In 1962, an opportunity arose for Alice to work in artistic collaboration with Helen on Goblin Market, a work that Helen both directed and choreographed. The Belfast Modern Dance Group's first performance of this work was a key moment in Helen's career as a professional choreographer. She was supported personally and practically in this new professional venture by Alice, whose set design was reviewed as a happy blend of realistic and abstract, created using pale blue-grey curtains with tree effects. That success was soon followed in November 1964 by Phases, one of the most important performances that Helen directed. Phases first emerged from a series of conversations that Helen had with Alice on the relationship between colour and human attitudes. This modern performance, incorporating dance and music, was divided into 4 stages, corresponding to the stages of a man's life. And Helen explained that each section of the work was defined by a colour. Orange, Helen said, represented the initial phase of first expression. Grey, a second phase called impasse. Black depicted a third phase of persecution. And blue, the final phase of maturity. Alice's involvement in the early concept of phases is evident in this use of colour motifs, which informed the costumes and the lighting that she designed for the performance. The importance of colour as more than just an aesthetic, rather as a force with the power to convey, affect, and transform emotion, was a belief that was shared, developed, and pursued by Helen and Alice in both their solo and collaborative work. A review of Alice's 1966 exhibition at the MI Arts Council Gallery provides a deeper explanation of Alice's use of colour in her abstract work, and it bears a striking resemblance to Helen's explanation of the symbolism that's present in Phases. This is a quote from A.W. Bauer's review of that exhibition. He said, "What is not generally realised about Alice's work is that the colours used have a special significance for the artist. It is not easy to put into words how exactly she feels about certain colours, but here is an attempt. Blue, for example, has a spiritual value and represents an awakening quality. Green means the conscious effort to go on in spite of difficulty. Red and orange are physical colours to get the strength to do things, said the artist. Brown is not aware of the values that matter. It is inactive, dormant, not conscious." Phases drew heavily on Helen's experiences of fear, persecution, and imprisonment, explored through a nameless figure around whom the dancers moved and interacted. Some of the press described Helen as a Prague exile, and they claimed that no one who watched her demonstrate gracefully to her dance group would realise that she was the she was a prisoner in a German concentration camp. But importantly, Helen refused to be drawn on the autobiographical influences of Faye's third act. A substantial press review on the Belfast Modern Dance Group reported that the persecution section was, quote, based on Mrs. Lewis's wartime experiences about which she does not talk anymore. Faces was at its core and in its performance an abstract work, representing the limitations and the potential of universal human experience. Although the press asked Helen to draw direct parallels with the horrors of the Holocaust, she presented to audiences the intellectual opportunity to experience and interpret the work independent of literal or historical references. The performance of Phases in Festival 1964 put Helen's modern dance on the front page of the Belfast newsletter. This is a blow-up of the picture there on the right-hand side. You can see 3 of her dancers here were photographed. It includes Maddie Tongue, actually, at the 3D meeting at the front. They have their arms outstretched, and crucially, they're dressed in modern, unfussy costumes. This was a public display of abstract modern dance under the direction of Helen Lewis. In July 1965, Helen featured on the BBC One television programme Seeing and Believing, which included an excerpt from Phases performed by members of the Belfast Modern Dance Group. Helen's most modern work, conceived and developed alongside Alice, had transitioned, albeit in a modest form, from the elite margins of high culture to the century's most dominant broadcast medium, television. Helen and Alice's next major collaboration was their interpretation of a rarely performed piece of theatre by the Russian conductor Igor Stravinsky. The Soldier's Tale had never been performed in Belfast before Helen directed it in 1965, and she forewarned audiences that her production would not be a traditional ballet, rather a performance to be read, played, and danced. This production was unusual in combining mime, spoken dialogue, dance, and narration with a musical score, and newspapers encouraged audiences not to miss this, quote, intriguing and spicy entertainment that surely deserves more frequent performance. The programme for the event also included a production of Phases alongside 2 Bohemian dances by Smetana. The selection and curation of classical Czech and Russian works alongside pioneering modern dance demonstrated Helen's vast range of cultural reference points and experiences. By setting Phases alongside Smetana and Stravinsky, Helen also created a striking contrast of styles that showcased both the technical abilities of her group and her decades of experience in dance and choreography. Set and costume design was again entrusted to Alice, and the visual richness of the performance was reproduced on a page full of images in the Belfast Telegraph. In the cultural life of 1960s Belfast, this was, the newspaper said, an occasion not to be missed. In 1968, during a major reorganisation of the Lyric Players, the organisation's trustees took the decision to move the theatre from the small building at the O'Malley's home in Derrygulgy Avenue to the large modern site of Snarmillis. The financial cost of these changes also meant the permanent closure of the Lyric New Gallery at Grosvenor Road. Although Alice had conceded at the commencement of the venture that the new gallery could never be commercially successful, she saw the Lyric Players' support for the gallery as an act of solidarity with visual artists and a belief in a community of artists informing and shaping each other's work. Alice wrote to Frank Benner, he was then chairman of the Lyrics Board of Trustees, to voice her strong opposition towards his plans to close the new gallery. And Alice said in her letter, "Artists and musicians, dancers and highly trained actors are all needed to contribute to a theatre of quality. All of these considerations made the idea of running a gallery, in spite of the considerable amount of work and time involved, very much worthwhile to me. Should these ideas no longer be valid, may I be permitted to state that my personal interest in directing the gallery would cease." Despite Alice's protest, the planned closure went ahead. The new gallery's last art exhibition opened to the public in June 1969 and featured Sinclair Allen and Roland Davison. It was the first major exhibition for both young artists. Alice died only a few weeks later, on the 14th of July, 1969, aged 52. Her death, after a short illness, shocked the art community of Northern Ireland. It was a terrible personal loss for Helen. She wrote of the despair she felt on learning that Litsy's diagnosis was terminal. Despair, Helen's son said, was not a word Mom would have used lightly. Alice tried to hide the severity of her illness from Helen, who herself tried to conceal her knowledge that the lung cancer was terminal. Helen recalled the moment when both women recognized in each other the realization that Alice's death was imminent. Had it not been such a tragic moment, Helen wrote, we would have enjoyed once again our unity of thought and feeling. In the weeks following Alice's death, Helen suffered from what she termed an overwhelming sense of loss, in spite of Harry's and the children's efforts to restore some normality to my life. Alice's sister, Trudy, came to stay with Helen for some time to grieve alongside her late sister's closest friends. With Alice's passing, Helen lost one of her life's dynamic artistic influences. But as many of you here will know, Alice inspired Helen's 1970 work, There Is a Time. In Helen's words, Litsy came back through dance, a last spiritual collaboration. So what conclusions then can we make about this passionate and powerful friendship? Well, firstly, I think that refugee and Holocaust survivor journeys and trajectories are complex. They're also important, not least in reasserting the role of individuals as protagonists, rather than viewing them through the prism of the Nazi state. In the testimony and letters of refugees and survivors, we find the richness of individual lives, of personal and professional networks, of talents and friendships, a dense world of complicated connections. The town of Trutnov, this Austrian Belfast, is a case in point, featuring prominently in the intertwined lives of Helen, Harry, Alice, and Heinz. Reconstructing these networks and journeys can help the historian to resist writing the life stories of these individuals teleologically. On that point, it is also worth noting that self-identification is important. During the 1950s and 1960s, neither Helen or Alice wished to be defined by their wartime experiences. While the press may have made occasional reference to their Central European roots, both women wished to be recognized for their professional accomplishments. Secondly, Helen and Alice's recognition as professional artists came about slowly. Both women worked hard to have their art move from appearing alongside the recipes and fashion tips to the culture pages and eventually to the front pages. They endured bad reviews, invested hours of unpaid labor, and juggled work with caring commitments to create and exhibit some of Northern Ireland's most important modern art. They never won over all the critics, but both women kept creating and pushing boundaries. Thirdly and finally, we have seen that Alice and Helen's friendship was important in both their professional and personal lives. It was a powerful force that drove each of them to keep evolving and improving their craft. It helped Alice to bring the ethical truths of performance to her paintings and helped Helen to enrich her dance with the colour of a painter's palette. In one of Alice's letters to Helen, she described their friendship using the German term Wahlverwandtschaften, and that refers to Goethe's novel Elective Affinities, in which he modelled human relationships as chemical reactions. And Alice described her friendship with Helen as rooted in Wahlverwandtschaften, this fundamental chemical connection. And she wrote to Helen that their friendship was built on this foundation. And she said that these friendships, quote, are usually of greater value and in our own spiritual sense, unavoidable and lasting. In this very personal piece of writing, Alice confided to Helen, I love you as dearly as if we were real sisters. Well, we are real sisters, only the physical side of it has erred. In their private and family lives, Alice and Helen's long friendship was a sustaining and enduring force, and it equipped them to build culturally rich and meaningful lives in a new city. Thank you.
questions?
Thank you for an excellent lecture. Just one tiny question, one observation. When Alice came to Northern Ireland, was there one particular person or reason she so quickly moved over to Northern Ireland?
Yeah, I believe so. I believe that while she was in Vienna, she had made arrangements with an Austrian businessman by the name of Alfred Neumann to come over as one of his workers. So Neumann had set up a number of companies under the New Industries Development Act. He established a number of factories in Derry. There's quite a substantial community of Viennese refugees in Derry. And he also established smaller, they were called cottage industries in Newtownards and some other locations, and he established factories in Belfast. Neumann's a really interesting individual. He moved over to the UK in, I think, around 1933, but he never naturalised. And in fact, he was arrested during the war. He couldn't prove that he was a friendly alien. He was arrested and he was deported to Canada, and he sailed on the Arendora Star, which was torpedoed off the coast of Donegal, and he died at sea. He drowned at sea. And I imagine Alice and those other members of the Viennese Jewish community that came here felt that loss very, very keenly. The Northern Ireland government were quite reluctant to work with Alfred Neumann. He was a little bit unpredictable. He put a notice in the Jewish press telling people that the Northern Ireland government wanted them to come over, and that really wasn't the case. And you can see the government receiving dozens and then hundreds of applications, and they really stopped replying to them. And I think Neumann becomes persona non grata, and he isolates himself, and he doesn't have anyone writing a letter of support apart from Alice and her colleagues at Dufferin Avenue. They write support to say that that Neumann saved their lives and brought them over. So she comes over really quickly. She's only in London for those couple of days. She's rushed over to NI, and in fact, 3 days after she arrived, she's being hosted at a civic reception with these other refugees. So it's a really remarkable arrival. I didn't quite have the time to sort of look at that aspect of it, but it's such an interesting, it's a piece of Northern Ireland's history. That bit of legislation allows people to set up factories. You have a similar bit of GB legislation, so you have factories in North Wales, I think around Sheffield, but it's very small numbers of Jewish refugees are allowed to work in paid employment. But Alice was one of them, and that's why she comes here so quickly.
And just one thing, Neil Shawcross is portrait.
Yes.
Alice.
Oh, it's beautiful.
Given the manner of her death,
yes.
she's
yes.
sitting so obviously enjoying a cigarette.
She was rarely seen without cigarettes. She wrote a letter to Helen, well, I think it was her last letter, and she said to Helen how she has to give up cigarettes. And she said, I've given them up for 9 days and I feel very superior. But she was rarely seen without them, and you're right, it's a very poignant painting by Shawcross of Alice seated, smoking. It's a tremendous thing.
Can you tell us something about the art institution that she trained in Vienna?
I can't find very much on her time there. So the School of Arts and Crafts in Vienna covers teenage years, but it also trained people into adulthood as well. But from the records I can see, she enrolled there around the age of 12. The Peter Brooks discussion of her, which is an online article, is excellent. And he writes about how Chiswick's selection of children and young people who were enrolled at the school were generally people who hadn't received recognition or formal training. So Alice is a little bit unusual in that she had won that diploma, so she obviously had some skill, but Chiswick was quite keen that children would come unformed so that he could train them. It's interesting, when she comes to Northern Ireland, they misattribute to her that she is a teacher at that school. She's one of the leaders of this school, and she isn't. But I think the press are quite keen to talk up the credentials of those refugees who come. But yeah, so it's an arts and crafts school. She trains there through her teens, and I believe has quite close contact with Chiswick.
Sorry, could I just follow that up? I had a vague recollection, but I thank you again so much for your talk. And what you said about Alice Berger Hammerschlag was really new to me. But I remember some reference to her somewhere, I may be quite wrong about this, as an Austrian artist. And I have a very vague recollection of having seen one or two of her works in Vienna.
Yeah, that's right. She does.
That's right.
Yeah,
in the Belvedere
yes.
Museum in Vienna.
And the there are some held in Vienna, and actually her early collections that she exhibits in Northern Ireland include scenes of Vienna as well. So she doesn't do very many, and Anna will know more of this, she doesn't do very many landscapes, but she has some early landscapes which depict scenes in Vienna, and also I think some country childhood retreats as well. Is it called View of a Lake? Yeah. So I think so. Yeah. So she's they like to in the early days call her this Viennese artist, and then they really own her, and they start to say, oh, she's an Ulster artist. So they drop that bit, and she kind of gains that recognition.
We think we'll take one more question.
Can I just say and echo the thanks for your talk. It stands alone as a marvelous insight into that extraordinary friendship and relationship, but it's also a wonderful companion piece to Maddie Tung's book about him, which to me gave an insight I've never had before into what dance actually means and does, in the way that your talk has given into Alice's work. So it stands alone, and it also makes that wonderful companion piece. And as a member of the board of the Linden Hall Library, I'm delighted that the library has given you the platform on which to deliver an extraordinary talk. Thank you very much.